Picture a Victorian street in the 1800s. Horse carts rattle over cobblestones, gentlemen tip their hats, ladies glide past in enormous dresses that seem to float like fabric clouds around them. The fashion of the age demanded spectacle, wide skirts, towering crinolines, and layers upon layers of cloth. Even Queen Victoria herself wore these magnificent gowns. In Victorian society, the crinoline became the symbol of respectable femininity. A proper lady was expected to appear elegant, modest, and perfectly composed. But beneath those beautiful skirts was a hidden reality no etiquette book liked to discuss, because those dresses were not just decorative. They were enormous, heavy, and incredibly inconvenient. Which raises a surprisingly practical question. How did Victorian women go to the toilet while wearing them? And perhaps even more awkwardly, how did they deal with menstruation? To answer that, we have to step into the everyday world of Victorian hygiene, a world that was far messier than the polished portraits suggest. First, forget modern bathrooms. In the early Victorian era, flushing toilets and sewer systems were still rare. Indoor plumbing existed only in the most advanced buildings, and most homes relied on much simpler solutions. For centuries, people had relieved themselves wherever they could find privacy: fields, alleys, gardens, or dark corners behind buildings. Inside homes, however, there was one essential household object: the chamber pot. You may recognize the old expression, "He doesn't have a pot to piss in." The phrase comes directly from this time. If a person truly didn't own a chamber pot, they had no choice but to go outside. Victorian cities were notoriously filthy places. Waste was often thrown directly into the street, contributing to the overwhelming stench that many visitors described. In fact, some historians believe the popularity of high-heeled shoes and umbrellas had a practical purpose. They helped people avoid stepping into the unpleasant substances that regularly appeared on city streets. By the 19th century, chamber pots were found in nearly every home. Their purpose was simple: to collect urine and feces during the night or when no outdoor facilities were available. In Britain, chamber pots even had nicknames. One common slang term was the jerry. These pots usually came with the lids. After someone used one, the lid was placed back on top as a signal that it was full. If another person needed one, they simply reached for a different pot nearby. In wealthy households, chamber pots were hidden carefully from view. Servants checked them throughout the day and quietly removed them before guests could notice. Some houses even disguised them inside furniture. Special commode chairs or benches concealed a chamber pot beneath the seat, allowing people to relieve themselves discreetly indoors. But eventually the pots had to be emptied, and that process was not always pleasant. Some buildings included primitive toilet spaces known as garderobes. These small closets were often located on upper floors and positioned above alleyways or narrow streets. When chamber pots were emptied out of windows, people below were sometimes warned with a shouted phrase, "Gardez l'eau." The words roughly translate to "watch out for the water." Of course, what came down from above was not exactly water. Many streets had shallow gutters to carry away the waste, and raised stepping stones allowed pedestrians to cross without wading through the filth. Oddly enough, chamber pots also played a role in warfare. During periods like the Napoleonic Wars and the English Civil Wars, officials sometimes collected the contents of household pots. Why? Because urine could be refined into saltpeter, a key ingredient used in making gunpowder. What most people saw as disgusting waste was actually valuable to governments preparing for war. Now, Imagine dealing with all of this while wearing the clothing of a Victorian lady. Fashion demanded layers. A typical woman wore a long linen shift, multiple petticoats, and a massive crinoline cage that held the skirt in a wide bell shape. On top of that came the overskirt and bodice. The result was a dress that could weigh several pounds and stretch several feet across. Yet underneath all that fabric, there was usually one garment missing: underwear. For much of the Victorian era, women did not wear knickers. The open space beneath their skirts actually made daily functions easier. Later in the century, drawers began appearing, but even these were unusual. Early versions consisted of two separate legs joined only at the waist and back. The front remained open, with overlapping fabric. In other words, they were crotchless. This design allowed women to relieve themselves without removing their heavy clothing. Using a chamber pot while wearing a crinoline required some creativity. Because women typically wore no knickers, the pot could simply be lifted up beneath the skirts. Some chamber pots were specially designed for this purpose. These were often oval-shaped, with indented sides that fit comfortably between the thighs. In other cases, a woman placed the pot on the floor, lifted her skirts, stepped over it, and squatted. At social events such as balls or dinners, houses often provided retiring rooms where women could go privately. These rooms contained multiple chamber pots and were attended by maids. A lady's maid would assist by lifting the skirts, positioning the pot, and afterward wiping the area with a damp cloth. Moments later, the lady would return to the ballroom as though nothing had happened. Cleaning afterward was another challenge. Victorians used many different materials for wiping. One of the most common tools was the dried corn cob. By rotating it gently, it could clean the area surprisingly well. Another option was a sea sponge attached to a handle. After each use, it was rinsed in a bucket of salt water or vinegar. Other materials included leaves, straw, and seashells. As paper products became cheaper, people began using newspapers, catalogues, and magazines. Although patents for toilet paper appeared in the late 19th century, the rolled toilet paper we know today was not widely produced until the early 20th century. Victorian women also had to manage menstruation without modern hygiene products. Interestingly, women during this era often experienced fewer periods than women today. Many reached menopause earlier, sometimes in their mid-30s, and poor nutrition or heavy labor could disrupt regular cycles. Still, menstruation was a reality. Instead of disposable products, women relied on reusable solutions. One common item was the tea bandage, a cloth garment shaped somewhat like modern underwear. Inside it, women placed absorbent rags. Poorer women sometimes used moss or other natural fibers instead. These cloth pads were washed and reused each month. Historical records suggest women might change them 12 to 20 times per day during heavier flows. Even cleaning the dresses themselves was a massive undertaking. Victorian clothing was not washed frequently. Laundry required enormous amounts of water, fuel, and labor. So many households only washed clothing twice a year during what was known as the Great Wash. Instead of frequent washing, garments were often cleaned by sprinkling them with talcum powder and brushing it away. This removed oils and helped mask odors. When not in use, dresses were stored in cedar-lined trunks or closets, which protected them from moths and insects. Although Victorian clothing was often beautifully made, many garments were worn repeatedly until they became extremely worn or unbearably smelly. Fortunately, the layers underneath, shifts, chemises, and petticoats could be washed more regularly. Victorian fashion may look elegant in paintings and photographs, but behind the graceful silhouettes and sweeping skirts was a daily life filled with complicated solutions, uncomfortable realities, and very different standards of hygiene. The next time you see a grand Victorian gown, remember that managing it required far more effort than simply looking fashionable. Because beneath all that elegance, Victorian life was far messier than it appears.